I am.
Okay.
Let me just put this on airplane mode.
It's my pleasure today to introduce our speaker. So I've known Shep virtually my entire academic career. So when I was an undergraduate at McMaster, I took a behavior and learning class that Shep taught. And the things that I learned have stayed with me my entire career. So things like experimental control, tight linkages between your theory and your operational definitions. And that course, which we don't offer anymore, we offer something like it. I think Aisha teaches 2GG3, right. Learning and shaping behavior, shaping and learning behavior.
And cover a lot of Shep's work.
Right. So we revived that course, but it moved away. And when I was hired as a faculty member, I thought, oh, I'm going to take that course again because Shep had this great way of teaching that every lesson sort of ended in a way that the next lesson started. So you never felt like you were. It wasn't like it was just here's a chunk of information, here's another chunk of information. Constant flow. So when I was an assistant professor, I was still learning from Shep about teaching, and I sat through the entire class. It was then a split class. I think Reuven taught half of it on animal behavior, and then you taught learning.
Right.
Assistant professor, I learned there. And even just this year, I'm still learning from Shep because I used his article, his science article that I'm sure he's going to talk about, as an example of excellent writing in my writing course, just a month ago. And if you get a chance to read the paper, if you have read the paper, it's just a beautiful example of each paragraph being its own thought, and that thought being well articulated in the topic sentence. And so the paper just reads itself. You don't have to work. Shep's contributions, aside from to me, have been astronomical. He's changed the way people think about addiction, and a lot of the work that he did here. And he's going to tell us about that long journey about learning about the ghost in the attic. Welcome to Shep.
Thank you. Thank you very much, David. Can you hear me in the back? Yeah, okay. Well, drug withdrawal symptoms I generally considered a complication of addiction. They're uncomfortable, they precipitate relapse to addiction, and the drug user, I hope to convince you that withdrawal symptoms are not evidence of pathology, but rather they're a good thing. That is, we should be happy that addicts show withdrawal symptoms. And this is based on a Pavlovian conditioning analysis of drug dependence. It's a topic of the book with this title that's recently published by MIT Press. I can't cover the entire book in the short time available, but I'm going to just give you the highlights of it. Because of time constraints, I won't present any data. This is going to be different than other colloquia. There won't be a presentation of data. Rather, though, I will assert what experimenters have found. And this talk is really a preachment rather than a colloquium. Addicts are haunted by the residual effects of prior drug use. Cocteau wrote about his overcoming of morphine addiction, of opium addiction, and he was constantly haunted. Even years of abstention didn't prevent him from occasionally having withdrawal symptoms and craving for the drug. And several former drug users have also described this, both in terms of opium and morphine and heroin and fentanyl and alcohol, how they are, when they least expect it, in a spontaneous way, or smokers too, they're suddenly overcome with a desire for the drug. And the individual is doing fine and is drug-free for a considerable period of time, and the appearance of the ghost is particularly unpredictable, but it's not unpredictable. The ghost appears to the addict in a certain set of circumstances that were first, to my knowledge, enumerated by Benjamin Rush. Benjamin Rush was a colonial physician in the United States. He was a signer of the Declaration of Independence. He was a physician to the Revolutionary Army, and he said that he was concerned about excessive alcohol consumption, which is a drug that was primarily addictive in colonial America, and he noted an important feature of alcoholism. He said the operation of the human mind obliges it to associate ideas accidentally or otherwise combined. Alcohol is one such idea, and men, who were the only alcoholics, I guess, were evidence withdrawal symptoms when they were in circumstances that they had previously used alcohol, and by restraining them from places which suggested ardent spirits, the habits of intemperance may be completely destroyed. So the ghost appeared, although he didn't use that terminology, when the alcoholic was in circumstances or was among friends with whom he had usually used the drug. The idea that relapse is often seen in the presence of stimuli that has been paired with drug use has been constantly rediscovered by successive generations of addiction researchers. And they all, without acknowledging prior work, make the same observation. So when anti-narcotic legislation became a feature of the United States, a primary functionary in that department was Lawrence Cole. And he noted that even after addicts, morphine addicts in this case, were successfully treated, when they went back to circumstances in which they used the drug before, they were released, they went home, and they relapsed to drug use when they were confronted with stimuli that had previously been paired with the drug. Cole rediscovered a phenomenon that was described 130 years earlier by Benjamin Rush, and we now know that this apparition created by drug paired, by the way, the people are unconscious, are not conscious of them having withdrawal symptoms in the presence of stimuli that had been that had in the past been paired with the drug, unless they're students of Pavlovian conditioning, which is unlikely. But we now know that these symptoms in the presence of stimuli that are impaired with the drug are not mischievous, but rather protects the addict from mortal danger. Consider the case of opiate overdose. There are hundreds of thousands, there are over 100,000 cases of opiate overdose in the United States last year. The mechanism of overdose deaths seems straightforward. Opiates cause respiratory depression. The opiate addict wants to take as much drug as possible. Often the opiate is enriched with the morphine is enriched, or heroin is enriched with synthetic opiates like fentanyl, which are very powerful. The addicts pursue ever higher highs, and it seems the addict simply takes too much drug and suffers an overdose. That's the usual interpretation of overdose, and it is inadequate. The early realization that overdose is a misnomer came over half a century ago. The medical examiner of New York was Milton Halpern, and in the 60s, there were many, many cases of heroin overdose. He examined these cases. He examined the contents of the drug remaining in the syringe. He examined the individual to see how much morphine, how much heroin they self-administered. And he examined the heroin packages found near dead addicts. And he often noted that the individual who died from a heroin overdose took a similar dose the previous day and had no ill effects. And I hope you can read that, but the medical examiner of New York concluded that does not appear to be a quantitative correlation between the amount of, between the lethal effect and the amount of heroin taken. This fact has been rediscovered by successive generations of medical examiners in many places in the world, and they all confirm Milton Halpern's observation. So Halpern was succeeded by Cherubin, who also examined the bodies of dead addicts and concluded that it's a idiosyncratic reaction to an intravenous injection of unspecified materials. Green was a medical examiner in Washington, D.C., and he also examined heroin overdose cases, much as Milton Halpern did, and Green concluded the term overdose indicates a lack of understanding of the true mechanism of death in these fatalities. Joseph Montefort was a toxicologist in Detroit, and he compared blood drug levels in overdose victims with those of heroin addicts who died as a result of homicide, but had self-administered heroin shortly before. So he examined people who recently took heroin who died as a result of homicide, and people who recently took heroin who died from a heroin overdose. And 3/4 of the heroin overdose victims had blood drug levels that were lower than or equal to of the non-overdose victims. And Montefort concluded that in the great majority of cases, death was not the result of the quantity of morphine in the blood. Meisner et al. In 2002 compared blood opioid levels of overdose victims with those of automobile drivers who were arrested, who had recently taken heroin and were stopped by police for driving offenses, and there was lots of overlap in blood morphine levels between people who did and did not suffer, who did and did not suffer an overdose. And he concluded that blood levels of free morphine, heroin is metabolized to morphine, do not allow a reliable prediction of survival versus non-survival. It's an international finding. In Iran, the equivalent of the medical examiner, Mirabicki studied overdose victims in Iran and concluded that the continued utilization of the term overdose is counterproductive because they don't suffer from too much morphine. Shane Dark studied overdose victims in Australia and concluded that blood morphine concentrations are frequently below those of fatal cases, are frequently below those of heroin users who died for causes other than drug toxicity. In half a century, this is half a century of research, where people do not acknowledge the work of previous investigators, but they all reach the same conclusion, that overdose victims die for an amount of drug that is inadequate to kill them. Well, if drug dose can't explain, if drug quantity can't explain overdose, what is it? Well, the traditional reasons why drug users suffer an overdose are well publicized. The drug is enhanced with potent synthetic opiates like fentanyl. The individual takes other nervous system depressive drugs like alcohol in conjunction with the opiate, and they suffer an overdose. All these are well publicized and all account for some cases of overdose. But less well known is that the addict is at risk for overdose if they take the drug in a novel environment, an environment that has not previously been paired with the drug. Role of environmental novelty in overdose wasn't discovered until 1982. And Benjamin Rush and Lawrence Kolb and many others noted that the individual displayed withdrawal symptoms when they were presented with drug-associated cues. If they take the drug in the presence of drug-associated cues, they're likely to survive. If they take the drug in the absence of these cues in a novel environment, they're at risk for overdose. There are many, many reports that indicate the importance of environmental novelty in overdose. There is a Hungarian investigator by the name of Grevich who studied in detail an overdose victim in Budapest. He was found in a public toilet with the paraphernalia of addiction at his side, the syringe, envelope containing heroin, and he was found dead, and he was determined that it was heroin overdose. But post-mortem examination of this individual, who's called KJ, indicated that he self-administered an amount of opiate that was too small to kill him. Indeed, although he took the opiate in a public toilet, which is the usual place for opiate addicts to self-administer, KJ had never before administered in a public toilet. KJ had always administered at home with his wife, who was also an addict. And due to unusual circumstances, he took his usual dose of the drug in this novel environment and immediately suffered an overdose. The circumstances surrounding the fatal drug administration are usually not part of the pathologist's report. The study of the circumstances surrounding the drug administration, although not well publicized, are well publicized when it comes to celebrities who overdosed. There's a lot of interest in overdoses by celebrities, and has been pointed out by many people. Many celebrities overdose in a place that is other than a usual drug administration environment. All these people overdosed when they were at places other than their home, which is where they usually administered the drug. So a large number of celebrities overdose in unusual circumstances. In one study in Barcelona, examined everybody administered to a hospital who had recently used heroin, some because of overdose, which is reversed by giving an opiate antagonist, naloxone, and some for other reasons, being admitted to a hospital, but they had recently used heroin. They had similar blood morphine levels, and all those that had recently used heroin but had not suffered an overdose self-administered the drug in their usual administration environment. All those who had, in fact, overdosed and were subsequently questioned when they were revived with naloxone indicated that they administered the drug in a novel setting. There are case reports. For example, one case report of a pancreatic cancer patient by the name of N.E. N.E. was in palliative care at home and was given about 100 morphine injections over 4 weeks. The injections were administered by one of his sons, who always carefully measured the morphine and had it checked by the other son. So everything was fine. The morphine was effective in alleviating the pain of pancreatic cancer. However, one day, for unknown reasons, the patient pulled himself out of his usual environment, which is a sick room compared with a bed and dimly illuminated and set up like a hospital room, into the living room, which was completely different environment. The son found his father in the living room. It was a time for the usual morphine injection, and he was administered a 101st morphine injection in a different environment in which the 100 morphine injections had been administered before. The patient suffered an overdose and died from this morphine administration. Well, these findings indicating environmental cues importantly contribute to overdose are all anecdotal reports. You have to really do an experiment in which some addicts get the drug in the usual administration environment and some addicts get the drug in a novel environment, and you determine the difference in lethality of the drug in the two environments. Well, the environment can't be done with humans, obviously. However, it can be done and has been done with animals. It was done at 3 different times in 3 different places by 3 different research groups, all working independently, all using different drugs, and they determined the environmental specificity of overdose. The red bar indicates the rats and mice in different experiments getting the high dose of the drug in the first time in their life, and there's a very high mortality rate. The other bars, DT and ST, the blue and yellow bars, are getting the drug after a history of smaller drug administrations. They get this final drug either in a different tested environment, DT, the blue bars, or the same tested environment, ST, the yellow bars. And there's a tremendous difference in mortality. Different tested animals tend to succumb to the drug. Same tested animals do not succumb to the drug. And this was found with heroin, with the barbiturate pentobarbital, and with alcohol. So the ghost elicited by drug-associated cues can save the addict's life. It is not a bad thing, it's a good thing. Why is taking the drug in a novel environment a risk factor for overdose? Well, first we have to understand why individuals suffer, why individuals tend to survive an overdose. The drug user usually survives even a high dose of the drug because these potential threats to survival are detected in early stages and elicit counter responses that diminish the effect. We do not set up a bulwark against physiological insults. Rather, we make responses that attenuate the physiological insult. These counter responses elicited by physiological stimuli have been termed homeostatic responses. Homeostasis was a term invented by Walter Cannon in 1932 when he wrote a book, a famous book, called The Wisdom of the Body. And Cannon stated, if a state remains steady, it does so because any tendency toward change is automatically met by increased effectiveness of the factors which resist the change. Taking a drug can induce a tendency toward change, and understanding the factors which resist the change is central to understanding addiction. These homeostatic responses that we have to all types of physiological insult occur automatically. They're not under voluntary control. They are unconscious, and they're part of the hard wiring of our bodies. They save our life every day of our lives. We are homeostasis machines. And with repeated drug use, these homeostatic responses are enhanced. They get bigger and bigger. Why does a drug effect? So since the homeostatic response gets bigger, the drug effect gets smaller over repeated administrations. It's called tolerance to a drug. Why does the drug effect get smaller over repeated administrations? Why does the homeostatic response get more profound over repeated administration? Well, it's because of Pavlovian conditioning. Ivan Pavlov and Walter Cannon were friends and colleagues. This is a picture taken the year before Pavlov, which is on the left, died, and he in St. Petersburg. And when Pavlov visited the United States, he stayed at Cannon's house in Cambridge. They were very, very good friends. And although they were friends and colleagues, their work had very little influence on each other. And that's an enigma. That's an enigma. Why? Pavlov didn't incorporate homeostatic concepts in his conditioning research, and Cannon didn't incorporate conditioning responses in anticipation of physiological perturbation. Ivan Pavlov demonstrated that the body is even wiser than Walter Cannon thought. We remember Pavlov for conducting conditioning research. That was all done in the last third of his scientific career. He didn't start studying agree with the conclusion reached by Ramsey and Woods. All these experiments involve learning manipulations, non-pharmacological manipulations of environmental cues that affect learning, and they also affect drug tolerance. So if taking a learning course, you know what all these phenomena are. They are ways of affecting the strength of a conditional response. They don't involve any pharmacological manipulation, and they all affect drug tolerance in a way that would be expected if learning contributes to drug tolerance. Well, the idea that learning contributes to drug tolerance was originally discovered with morphine in rats. And at first, it elicited some skepticism. As I said, it was discovered in 1975, and just 5 years later, the noted alcohol researcher, Ray Hodgson, noted that although the alcoholic was tolerant to alcohol, as he said, in the usual drinking environment, would not inevitably display this lack of tolerance if they took the drug in a novel environment. He said, of course, we must not take the animal analogs too literally. For example, we should not expect situational factors to be quite as strong in human drug dependence. It is very unlikely that an alcoholic who feels only slight intoxication after 4 doubles would be legless if he consumes the same amount on Italy moor. Well, nobody has determined whether a moor in West Yorkshire is a novel environment. But there have been lots of studies that conditioning contributes to tolerance to alcohol, just like it does to morphine, in both humans and animals. For example, consider the time of day of alcohol ingestion. Many of us have a drink at the end of the day. We relax with a drink at the end of the day. We have wine with dinner. We do not tend to drink in the afternoon. And here's a recent article in the New York Times, which you probably can't read, but it says, why does day drinking feel different? It was subtitled, "A Buzz in the Sun Can Hit Harder Than Dinnertime Drinks. Experts shed lights on this science." Well, this quote, psychiatrists and alcohol experts, end quote, interviewed for this article, offered several hypotheses as to why daytime drinking is more intoxicating than evening drinking. But they didn't recognize the primary reason. The primary reason is because alcohol has a greater intoxicating effect at the daytime because daytime cues are not usually paired with alcohol. The results of many experiments demonstrate that alcohol consumed in the afternoon leads to more impairment than if it's consumed in the evening. They involve usually college students that are given a measured amount of alcohol to drink either in the afternoon or in the evening. And there's the same amount of alcohol and it produces more intoxication if it's consumed in the evening. Many other experiments indicate that the environment of alcohol administration affects tolerance. And alcohol-associated cues are important for tolerance. So, for example, in one experiment, people were given a rather large measured amount of alcohol, either in the usual alcohol-associated environment, usual alcohol-associated beverage, which is a beer-flavored beverage, or in a novel beverage, a blue peppermint-flavored beverage, but it was the same amount of alcohol in the same volume of liquid in both experiments, and they got much more intoxicated when they drank the alcohol in the novel beverage than when they drank it in the usual beverage. As already mentioned, well before there was appreciation of the role of Pavlovian conditioning in drug addiction, some observers of addiction, especially alcoholism, noted the importance of drug-associated cues. We talked about Benjamin Rush, we talked about Lawrence Cole, and also an investigator by the name of McNeish in 1835 noted that environmental cues associated with drinking, quote, lead to a longing for liquor. McIntosh pointed out, and his observations revealed, that these cues led to craving for liquor. And he went on to say, he offered a cure for addiction. Let him, if he can manage it, remove from the place of his usual residence and go somewhere else. Is moving away from your usual environment a cure for addiction? Well, according to some treatment procedures, like Alcoholics Anonymous, it's not. No matter where you go, there you are, is the dogma of Alcoholics Anonymous. But in fact, contrary to the dogma of Alcoholics Anonymous, but in agreement with conditioning interpretations of tolerance, of addiction, there is evidence that relocation works. When you go to a new environment, there you are indeed, but with any luck, your old drug-associated cues are not there. Residence relocation has been studied since 1966. In many, many independent studies conducted by many individuals over many years, usually without citing previous work, all reach the same conclusion. Residence relocation is a treatment for alcoholism, is a cure for alcoholism. Different studies have been done in Los Angeles, Detroit, New Orleans, Baltimore, Atlanta, San Antonio, Vancouver, Stockholm, and Canberra. All independent studies, all indicated that moving away from your usual environment is a treatment for addiction. For example, in a San Antonio study, the frequency of one-year abstinence was 3 times higher in relocated addicts than in addicts staying in San Antonio. 81% of the relocated addicts relapsed alcohol use when they went back to the environment in which they had drunk before. In August 2005, Hurricane Katrina damaged most of the housing stock in New Orleans. Parolees were relocated to different places in Louisiana away from New Orleans after Hurricane Katrina. And many of these parolees were incarcerated for drug use. Parolees who returned to their original New Orleans environment were far more likely to relapse than parolees who stayed in a novel environment. And in a recent study, the authors concluded that relocation is consequential because it separates individuals from environmental cues associated with prior drug use. The most convincing evidence that relocation leads to a cure for addiction is found in returning Vietnam veterans. Heroin use was very, very substantial in Vietnam. Heroin was freely available, and based on most studies, about a third of the addicts, of the veterans, had used a lot of heroin while in Vietnam. And a tremendous social problem was thought to occur when these veterans were returned home. They would get treatment but the result of treatment of most addicts is relapse to addiction. And so a tremendous problem was anticipated, but that didn't happen. Returning Vietnam veterans did not relapse to addiction the way treated addicts in the ghetto returned to addiction. And association by pairing is inevitable and unconscious. It can be a lifesaver because it saves you from overdose, but it sometimes has problematic effects. You're confronted with cues associated with the drug. You might be long abstinent, but you display drug preparation symptoms, erroneously called drug withdrawal symptoms, and if the anticipated drug is not forthcoming, the learned drug preparatory responses achieve full expression. They are not due to the baneful effects of all the previous drug administrations, rather they're due to the preparation for the forthcoming drug administration, which doesn't actually occur because the addict no longer uses drugs. They are the ghosts that haunt the addict. We cannot will ourselves to avoid anticipating a second event, given that we're presented with the first. The automatic effect of association by pairing is illustrated by the occasional maladaptive nature of such responses. Consider, for example, something that has been studied a lot, the broken escalator effect. Most adults have ridden an escalator a lot in their life, and they have learned to make postural adjustments to remain upright even when the ground is moving at an angle under their feet. And if they approach a non-functional escalator and they have to use the escalator as if it was stairs, they sometimes have some vertigo because they make the postural adjustments that they must make when confronted with these cues, but they do not attenuate the effect of the postural insult caused by the escalator movement. We don't call them escalator withdrawal symptoms, but rather they are, in fact, conditional responses. The inevitability of the conditional response occurring in the presence of the conditional stimulus was amusingly depicted in a short movie that was made in 1935. It was one of a series of movies that featured the Little Rascals. They were child actors who portrayed a motley collection of poor ragamuffins. In this short, called Mike Fright, the Little Rascals entered a competition to appear on a radio program. There were many children who entered this competition. The Little Rascals wanted to be the winner, and they found a way to sabotage one of the entrants, one of the people who entered the competition. The person was Little Leonard. Little Leonard entered the competition to Oh, you can't hear it.
My wild Irish rose.
There's Little Leonard. He's about to play the trumpet, which was his talent. And he played the trumpet really well, and a little rascal started eating lemons in front of him, and he was unable to complete playing the trumpet because he salivated so profusely.
How you like it? Well.
Drug addicts and former drug addicts can also be victims of Pavlovian conditioning. The long abstinent former addict, when might be an environment in which they previously used the drug, might be confronted by people with whom they usually use the drug, might see somebody using the drug, might see a picture of drug paraphernalia, and they make a variety of preparatory responses for the impending drug that, in fact, is not forthcoming. There are many, many experiments that have demonstrated this. They involve taking former addicts and hooking them up to a polygraph and having them handle the paraphernalia of addiction, the syringe or the spoon with which they cook up the heroin, and they show withdrawal symptoms, erroneously called withdrawal symptoms. There are case reports, for example, quote, after being detoxified and having served their sentence at the U.S. Public Health Service Hospital, the post-addict felt fine and had no craving for heroin or morphine. But on his way home, after arriving in his drug-ridden environment, he felt sick, craved a fix, and then hustled to attain it. Some post-addicts describe the sickness in more detail: runny nose, watery eyes, sweating, chills, nausea, and vomiting. One post-addict, a physician, said it was like the flu, and it resembled heroin abstinence phenomenon, but he dismissed that idea as ridiculous. Well, in fact, it's not ridiculous. The runny nose and watering eyes compensate for the secretory drying effects of the opiate. The sweating results from an elevation in body temperature, which compensates for the drug-induced decrease in body temperature. The chills result from vasodilation, compensating for vasoconstriction. The chills result from vasoconstriction, compensating for the vasodilatory effects. The nausea and vomiting result from an increase in peristaltic activity that compensates for the decrease in peristaltic activity produced by the drug. Well, in conclusion, addiction researchers have been puzzled, for the most part, by the appearance of so-called withdrawal symptoms long after the last drug administration. So one addiction researcher, Patrick Bernanke, said that this tendency of some people to relapse and become a re-addiction after long periods of abstinence is a perplexing aspect to addiction and a feature that should be addressed in any theory attempting to explain it. Well, I hope I have presented a theory attempting to explain it. And the withdrawal symptoms that they have are not actually due to withdrawal, they're due to the preparation for the next drug administration. The noted physiologist, Leroy Langley, said that any paper which is worth the paper it's printed on any paper in physiology should further clarify a homeostatic mechanism. I hope addiction further clarifies a homeostatic mechanism. Drug addiction is an example of homeostasis. And the paper that I hope is actually a book, The Ghost in the Attic, recently published by MIT Press. I have copies of the book here if anybody wants them. It sells for a ridiculous, MIT Press put a ridiculous price of $45 on it. By making a deal with MIT Press and by giving up my royalties, we're selling it for $25. So if anybody wants to buy the book for $25, they're welcome to it. Thank you very much.
We have lots of time for questions, so.
Yes?
Thanks, that was a fascinating talk. Really enjoyed it. It seems like there's a bit of a tension between the idea that relocation is a cure and that novel environments can cause fatality.
Right.
So it seems to me that if you relocate, it's sort of a temporary cure because now you
Or a risk for overdose.
yeah, a temporary cure for addiction.
But if you don't crave the drug in a novel environment, you're not going to take the drug,
Precisely.
and therefore you don't suffer an overdose.
Then you move back,
And then
and then you relapse, right?
that's right.
So
And you're protected from overdose if you move back.
right.
But so that's the
So
case.
I guess my question here is that when you relocate, it's been a while since I've taken a learning course, but it seems like you don't undergo any extinction paradigm to undo
No.
the conditional learning.
That's right. You
So
don't.
as soon as you return to your original, you still have the paired conditioned response.
That's right. So relocation doesn't do away with the prior learning. It just makes it irrelevant.
So it seems like a long-term actual cure for addiction would be to do actual extinction paradigm, where you're doing a lot more of actually unpairing.
Exactly. Exactly, and that's called Q exposure as a treatment for addiction. There are many, many studies of Q exposure in which the addict is presented with drug-associated stimuli, but prevented from using the drug.
Does that work on an actual physiological level with the homeostatic response?
There are mixed results of Q exposure because most of the time, the circumstances of drug administration are not adequately duplicated. The individual is in a laboratory and get pictures of drug paraphernalia, which is very different from being in the field and getting the drug. The Q exposure treatments that work are ones that tend to maximize the similarity between the pre-drug cues in Q exposure and in the actual use of the drug. And the most successful Q exposure treatment used alcoholics, in which the experimenter went to the usual drinking environment with the patient, and they drank soft drinks. And that was effective. There's Q exposure is actually described by Shakespeare in Macbeth, who the mother was cured for addiction to Macbeth's uncle by him telling his mother to quote, assume a virtue if you have it not. Refrain tonight and actually make the next abstinence more easy, the next more easy still. So that's an early demonstration of Q exposure treatment. Yes?
You spoke a lot about external cues, location and so forth. Can you talk a bit about internal cues?
Internal cues are very important and are very difficult to treat. But that's right. The individual might have taken a drug when they were anxious. And so in a state of anxiety, they might crave the drug. They might have taken a drug when they were afraid of some situation. And so being afraid for completely different reasons would cause relapse to addiction. It's not studied very much because it is very difficult to study that. But that would be the
It's
case.
almost like an accidental pairing.
That's right, exactly.
Locked in.
That's right, it does. Yes.
The effect of a novel environment would seem to complicate the picture of secure injection sites. Do people dare take that into account?
The secure injection sites are effective because the individual is in a novel environment, but there is always naloxone available. There is always people to treat the overdose victims. So there are many overdose victims when they self-administer in this novel environment, but they don't suffer any ill effects because they're given an antagonist. Yes?
Just to follow up, I spoke with somebody recently who worked at a safe injection site, and they were citing remarkably low sort of lethal overdose findings from their own site. And I think they themselves were thinking of the term safe. So I was actually thinking a little bit differently about it, that if they have a regular clientele, and if they always go
If they always go
safe
there,
injection site, that would feed perfectly into what you've been
that's right. If they always take their drug in a safe injection site, then the safe injection site would elicit the drug preparatory response that would save their lives. Yes?
Would you know of any successful pharmacological or surgical manipulations that can inhibit the homeostatic response to a substance?
I think there are, there are physiological manipulations that can affect the homeostatic response. And if somebody has some type of pathology, there is often not a homeostatic response, a normal homeostatic response. And they die because they suffer the effects of the physiological stimulation without the homeostatic response. But I can't think of any specific physiological or pharmacological manipulations. Yes?
I was particularly struck by the finding that veterans from Vietnam War, when they came back, that they didn't relapse. But I thought that veterans who served in wars, they experience PTSD and they do seek drug usage. So to me, that seems kind of opposite. Do you think these particular Vietnam War veterans somehow...
They don't have the stress of being in battle.
Sorry?
They don't have the stress of being in battle when they're released.
Because they were using the substance while they were there.
That's right. That's right. But it's just one of many, many studies that shows the importance of environmental cues in relapse. Yes?
I have two questions, if that's okay. The first, you presented decades of compelling evidence. You mentioned the AA, wherever you go, there you are. Why, in your opinion, why hasn't this gotten into these kind of rehab programs or others? What's the barrier to this knowledge being applied?
You're right. The message that I presented today is not widely disseminated among people who treat addicts or among addicts. If addicts knew they were at risk for overdose if they took a drug in a novel environment, lives would be saved. They don't know it because to tell the story, you have to start with Pavlovian conditioning. So it takes a long time to get to the moral of the story. And for some reason, it's not as widely disseminated as I would like.
Interesting. And if it's okay, I would ask one more, which is, you're talking about this condition response, just the addict and the drug, but what about the sort of family system or social support system around the addict? Do you see condition responses in people close that are kind of dealing with the ebbs and flows of the addiction?
So are you saying that if they take it with colleagues, that would be an important...
I guess, or say it's your brother and, you start to also have conditioned responses to his state
Oh,
when you know about.
it's interesting. I don't think there's a lot of research on the social transmission of conditional responses. So,
With that Little Rascals episode shows there's some social.
oh, the two little rascals
Yeah,
agreed
yeah.
to
That they
eat the
share a
lemon.
conditioned
yeah.
response.
You're right. So, I don't know of any research directly relevant to that. Yes?
Great talk, thank you very much. I guess my question is, has there been any research on like hierarchy to which sort of cues might be more important than others? So, like, for example, you said injecting a different room of the house that seems very similar to the one before, or sort of if big cues missing, that more of a risk of overdosing.
This gets into a learning phenomenon called overshadowing, where some cues are more salient than other cues, and that has not been studied in drug addiction, although it's an important topic. Yes?
How do you think peer pressure might affect behavior? So, for example, if you had some peers who were trying to convince you to take a substance and who had never done that substance before, do you think that they would be more resistant to peer pressure than if they already taken a substance with this group and they might be feeling some conditioned response in that setting?
The question concerned peer pressure and conditioned drug responses. The individual that is coerced by colleagues, by friends into taking the drug, would they take it for the first time in their life? Then that would be the first conditioning trial. And that, whatever environment or whatever friends they were with that compelled them to use the drug, they would be part of the stimuli that elicit a drug compensatory response.
So you highlighted the first learning response. So, as an addict, if they're taking the drug in multiple locations, does, I guess the Schwarler-Wagner model will say that learning goes down in each new location, the amount of information they gain from the new location.
I only know of one experiment that's concerned the effect of taking the drug in different locations, and it used rats. One group of rats was given the drug over and over again in the same location. Another group of rats was given the drug over and over again with a different location associated with the drug in each circumstance. Tolerance was much greater in the rats that got the drug in the same environment than in rats that got the drug in ever-changing environments. Yes?
There's a common phenomenon people refer to as like a drunk cigarette. People only smoke cigarettes when they're drunk. So my question is that can these conditioned responses almost stack on each other?
Yes,
For multiple substance use?
that's right, they do. They do. So if you normally smoke a cigarette when you self-administer an addictive drug like alcohol, which is very common, drinking alcohol and smoking a cigarette, then the cigarette is a cue for alcohol, and alcohol is a cue for the nicotine in the cigarette. Yes?
Talk about how the preparation symptoms help protect the lives of the substance users.
Yes.
So would you say that the ghost is almost to some extent an angel?
Yes, that is correct. The ghost is an angel. The ghost is very to be welcomed. Yes, Joe.
So, people who are addicted to smoking, is there a practical plan that you could advise on, short of going on vacation?
People who are addicted to smoking often report that if they leave their usual environment, they don't crave cigarettes anymore. Or if they're hospitalized, and almost all hospitals don't permit the use of cigarettes, they don't crave cigarettes. But when they go back to the usual environment, they do crave cigarettes. And smoking is very unique among addictions, because when you smoke, you have many different cues associated with the nicotine. You wake up in the morning, that's one cue. You drive to work, that's another cue. You sit down at your desk at your job, that's another cue. So most addictions don't have this many, many cues associated with drug use. And if you're protected from all of those cues by being, for example, hospitalized or on vacation, then that's a good way of stopping drug use. But if you go back to your usual nicotine-associated environment, all those cues elicit nicotine preparatory responses. Yes?
I'm still a little confused about the distinction between craving and these preparatory homeostatic.
It's a really good question. What's the relationship between craving and the preparatory responses that compensate the effect of the drug? I don't know, but I think it's because drugs are very powerful physiological insults, and they affect many systems, including neurochemicals in the brain. And the homeostatic neurochemical response is interpreted as craving for the drug. Thank you very much.
Remind everybody there's a reception upstairs on the second floor.